August 1942, New Guinea. The air was thick with humidity, clinging to everything. The jungle pressed in on all sides, a tangle of green that felt suffocating in its closeness. The Australian forces, fresh off a brutal defeat at the hands of the Japanese, were now scrambling to defend the territory they had left. In the dense wilderness, every step was a gamble. The Japanese had their eyes set on Port Moresby, a crucial position, and they were closing in. The Australians were running out of options. The Allies had expected the terrain to be difficult, but nothing could have prepared them for the brutal reality of jungle warfare. Heavy artillery, tanks, and air raids, methods that had worked in other places, proved useless here. The jungle was so thick that tanks couldn't even move across the land. The air support was nearly impossible to coordinate with all the trees and hills, and the constant rain washed away any hope of keeping clear roads for artillery. The conventional war tactics were failing. The Japanese, well entrenched in their positions, knew this. The Australian soldiers, on the other hand, felt the weight of uncertainty hanging over them. The ground beneath their boots was slippery, and the air was thick with the buzzing of unseen insects. This was where the Australians found themselves on a late August morning, facing the harshest of challenges. The numbers told a grim story. Out of 5,000 men assigned to the 39th Battalion, less than half could still move effectively. Casualties were rising daily as they fought desperately to hold on to every inch of land. The jungle had become a monster of its own, swallowing soldiers whole without a trace. To add to the misery, the weather was relentless. It rained for days on end, and the soldiers had no choice but to keep moving, often without rest. Sleep came in short, fitful bursts, and each day felt like a never-ending battle. The constant rain turned the ground into a slippery bog, making every step treacherous. But even more pressing was the looming threat from the Japanese. Reports showed they were getting closer by the hour. They were efficient, organized, and ruthless. The Japanese soldiers knew how to navigate the jungle just as well as the Australians did. They were expert in camouflage, moving silently through the dense foliage as they tracked their targets. To make matters worse, they had air superiority. The Japanese bombers swooped down from the sky, relentless in their attacks, their presence a constant reminder of how vulnerable the Australians were. The thought of being caught in the open with nowhere to run was terrifying. The soldiers knew it wouldn't take much for the Japanese to overrun them completely. But in the midst of this crushing despair, a new idea was brewing. It wasn't from the high command or the strategists sitting in comfortable rooms far away from the front lines. It wasn't from the experts who had spent their careers studying warfare in far, more predictable environments. It came from an unlikely source, Captain Horace William Mackenzie, a man who had spent more time studying the land than studying military tactics. Mackenzie wasn't a traditional soldier. He wasn't a graduate of military academies or a man who had risen through the ranks of the Army's elite. Before the war, Mackenzie had worked as a forest surveyor. He knew the land like few others. He understood the thick, tangled wilderness that surrounded them, its every twist and turn, its hidden paths and unseen dangers. While the senior officers remained focused on traditional methods of warfare, Mackenzie saw something they didn't. Where they saw an impenetrable jungle, Mackenzie saw opportunity. The dense trees, the heavy brush, the swamps, these were not obstacles to him. They were the keys to survival. The jungle could be used against the Japanese, turning the very environment that was hindering the Allies into their greatest weapon. But this wasn't an idea anyone else had considered. His proposal was as bold as it was untested. Instead of pushing large, heavily armed units through the jungle, the Australians should rely on small, mobile patrols, teams of soldiers who knew how to blend into the surroundings, move silently, and strike without warning. Mackenzie understood the enemy. He had seen the way the Japanese moved through the jungle, their silent movements and their ability to disappear into the underbrush. He knew the Japanese forces were stretched thin, but they were also incredibly skilled in navigating this terrain. If the Australians could turn the tables and use the same tactics, they might have a fighting chance. But his idea wasn't popular. It was seen as risky, even reckless. The High Command had little patience for such unconventional tactics. The generals and strategists were set in their ways. They were used to fighting battles with overwhelming force, with tanks and planes and big guns. The thought of small patrols sneaking through the jungle was almost laughable to them. They doubted it would work, and in many ways, they were right. It had never been done before. There was no blueprint, no historical precedent for this kind of warfare. But Mackenzie was convinced it could work. As the Australian forces faced their impending doom, Mackenzie began gathering a small group of soldiers who shared his vision. These men weren't the usual soldiers either. They weren't the biggest or the strongest. They weren't the most decorated. They were simply men who knew the jungle and could move with it, not against it. They understood how to be quiet when they needed to be, how to move like shadows, and how to read the land as if it were a map. The first test came on a quiet morning in early September, when Mackenzie and his hand-picked team were sent out to gather intelligence on Japanese positions. The orders were clear: move quietly, gather information, and return. The jungle was alive with sound, the hum of insects, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the occasional chirp of distant birds. But Mackenzie's team was undisturbed. They moved like ghosts, creeping through the thick foliage. Each step was carefully planned, each breath measured. They knew the stakes. They knew how deadly a mistake could be. The mission was a success. Mackenzie's men returned with vital intelligence that the Japanese forces hadn't even suspected they were being watched. For the first time, Mackenzie's idea had shown promise. But it was only the beginning. There were many who still doubted him, many who saw his tactics as reckless, dangerous even. The idea of using small patrols was still considered a long shot, and the success of this first mission wasn't enough to convince the higher-ups. But Mackenzie had planted a seed, and it was starting to grow. As the days wore on, the Australians were forced to adapt to their changing circumstances. The Japanese were relentless, and the ground. They fought on grew even more treacherous with every passing day. The weather, the terrain, and the enemy were all working against them. But Mackenzie's team had learned something crucial. They could survive by becoming one with the jungle. They could fight back, not by overpowering the Japanese with sheer force, but by using the environment to their advantage. The battle for New Guinea was far from over, but Mackenzie's patrols were beginning to shift the balance of power. It was a small victory, one that came at great cost, but it was enough to prove that even in the darkest of times, there was hope. And with each passing day, the Australians would learn more about how to use their greatest asset, the jungle itself. September 1942. In the jungle of New Guinea was no easier than the months before. The air was thick with humidity, and the heat clung to the soldiers like a wet blanket. The dense trees and tangled vines seemed to block out the sun, casting long, dark shadows that added to the oppressive atmosphere. The Australians were tired, hungry, and desperate, but Mackenzie had something different in mind. His idea of small patrols was no longer a mere theory. It was time to put it to the test on a larger scale. The success of his first mission had sparked hope, but now it needed to work in the real world, against the full might of the Japanese forces. Mackenzie's team was ready. He had handpicked each man, not for their size or strength, but for their ability to blend into the jungle, for their knowledge of the land. He was no longer simply teaching them how to move quietly. He was teaching them how to become part of the jungle, how to use the environment as their shield and weapon. The jungle wasn't just a place to hide, it was an ally. The trees could hide them, the mud could slow the enemy down, and the thick foliage could be a cover to launch a surprise attack. But first, Mackenzie had to prove it was more than just an idea. The first major test came in early October when Mackenzie and his patrol were sent on a dangerous mission. The goal was simple, but incredibly risky: sneak into Japanese territory and gather information on their troop movements. Mackenzie knew that if they were discovered, the entire unit could be wiped out. But it was a chance to show the high command that his methods were worth considering. The patrol was small, only a dozen men, each carrying the bare essentials: a rifle, some ammunition, a small supply of food, and a compass. No heavy equipment, no artillery, just the tools they needed to move swiftly and silently. The soldiers moved with careful precision, the jungle alive around them. Every step was quiet, every sound muted. There was no room for error. The Japanese, used to relying on their strength and technology, were now faced with a different kind of enemy: small, quiet forces that used the jungle as their shield. The first few days passed quietly. The soldiers moved at night, resting during the hot, humid days. They relied on the dense jungle to hide them, staying hidden from both the Japanese soldiers and the constant threat of aerial surveillance. The only sounds they made were the soft rustling of leaves underfoot, which quickly blended with the natural sounds of the jungle. They moved with a precision and stealth that seemed impossible for men weighed down by the dangers of the jungle. But the soldiers were learning fast. They had become part of the jungle itself, and it had become a tool they could use. As Mackenzie's patrol approached the Japanese encampment, tension hung in the air like a thick fog. They had no backup. If they were discovered, it would be a fight for their lives. The soldiers crouched low, moving forward inch by inch, their senses sharp, their hearts pounding. The sight of Japanese troops, tired, worn, and unaware of the danger that was closing in, only fueled their determination. Mackenzie's patrol had no intention of getting into a full-on confrontation. Their goal was information, and they needed it fast. They crept through the underbrush, using their knowledge of the terrain to stay hidden. The Japanese soldiers were close, so close that they could hear their voices, their footsteps. But Mackenzie's men were silent, staying just out of sight, moving like shadows through the thick foliage. The mission was a success. Mackenzie's patrol returned with critical information that the Japanese forces hadn't even suspected they were being watched. They had learned about the enemy's positions, their weaknesses, and even their supply routes. The information would prove invaluable in the coming weeks, helping the Australians plan their next steps and disrupt the Japanese forces. But more than that, it proved Mackenzie's idea had merit. It was not just a hopeful theory, it was a strategy that could work. However, this success came with a cost. The mission had been dangerous, and the toll it took on the men was evident. They were exhausted from the constant strain of moving through the jungle, their bodies covered in cuts, bruises, and insect bites. The wet conditions made everything difficult, and their clothes were soaked through with sweat and rain. But despite the hardships, there was a sense of pride. They had proven that the small patrols, their stealthy approach, could work. But this was only the beginning. Mackenzie knew that in order to fully convince the High Command and the rest of the Australian Army, they would need to take things further. Over the next few weeks, Mackenzie began to expand his patrols. He trained more soldiers, teaching them the same tactics, the same skills that had made his original team successful. But even as he did, there were those who doubted him. The senior officers, most of whom had risen through the ranks of traditional military doctrine, were still unconvinced. They saw Mackenzie's tactics as a dangerous gamble, a reckless approach to a war that required more than just stealth and speed. They were used to the idea of large-scale battles, of overpowering the enemy with sheer force. But Mackenzie's small patrols, moving in and out of the jungle with precision, was something new, something they couldn't fully understand. There was a constant tension between Mackenzie and the higher-ups. They didn't want to put too much faith in his methods, but they couldn't ignore the results. The intelligence his patrols were gathering was invaluable. They were striking fear into the Japanese soldiers, forcing them to rethink their approach. The idea that a handful of men could move through their lines without being detected was unnerving. But despite the successes, there was still a long road ahead. Mackenzie knew that he had to prove, again and again, that his approach could change the tide of war. Then, in late November, Mackenzie was given a new assignment, a larger-scale operation. It was a dangerous mission that would test his ideas like never before. This time, the goal was not just to gather intelligence, it was to disrupt the Japanese supply lines. The mission required more men, more resources, and more risk. Mackenzie's small patrols would now become a central part of the operation, and he would need to coordinate them in ways he had never done before. The stakes were higher. Failure was no longer an option. The Japanese were still advancing, and the Australians were running out of time. As Mackenzie prepared for this new mission, he could feel the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. The jungle, which had once been an obstacle, was now the key to victory. His small patrols had proven themselves, but now they were about to face the full force of the enemy. Mackenzie knew the risks. He had already seen what happened when things went wrong, but he was confident that his approach, his men, his knowledge of the jungle would make the difference. The Japanese had grown too comfortable, too sure of themselves. It was time to show them that the jungle wasn't just a place to hide. It was a weapon to be used. By December 1942, Mackenzie's small patrols had become more than just a new idea. They were changing the way the Australians fought. The intelligence gathered from these stealthy, quick missions had already started to disrupt the Japanese supply lines. Reports had confirmed that the Japanese forces were struggling to keep their troops supplied, as Mackenzie's patrols had destroyed key depots and ambushed convoys, leaving the enemy scrambling. The enemy's sense of security was shattered. They were no longer fighting a traditional army. They were fighting ghosts in the jungle, unpredictable and unseen. The Australians were beginning to see a new rhythm in their fight. They no longer had to rely on overwhelming artillery and airstrikes. Instead, they were learning how to use the jungle as an ally, as a tool that could be manipulated to strike quickly and retreat before the enemy had time to respond. Mackenzie's patrols were proving successful, but their impact was bigger than just the immediate victories. It was making the Japanese nervous, creating a sense of chaos within their ranks. The Japanese soldiers, usually so disciplined and well coordinated, were starting to make mistakes. They were losing track of where the Australians were. It was a critical weakness one Mackenzie's team had uncovered and used to their advantage. As Mackenzie's patrols grew more confident in their tactics, the numbers started to tell a different story. The effectiveness of these small mobile units was undeniable. Over the span of just a few weeks, Mackenzie's patrols had destroyed more than 30 supply lines, ambushed 6 major Japanese patrols, and killed or captured over 200 enemy soldiers. In a war where victory was often determined by the sheer weight of numbers and firepower, these were staggering results. The Japanese, once so confident in their technological advantage, now found themselves struggling against the unpredictable tactics of small patrols. The jungle, once their ally, had become a battleground they couldn't control. Despite the mounting success, Mackenzie's methods were still met with resistance. The traditional military leaders, the ones sitting comfortably in their command posts far from the front lines, continued to believe in the strength of large battalions and heavy artillery. They couldn't fully embrace the idea that small teams of soldiers could do the same or even better, with little more than their wits and the jungle around them. There was a strong pushback against the tactics, as some senior officers dismissed them as impractical. They argued that relying too much on these small patrols could stretch the Australians too thin, could result in high casualties, and might leave them without the manpower needed for a large-scale offensive. But as Mackenzie's patrols continued to return with more vital intelligence and success stories, even the skeptics had to admit the undeniable results. There were still those who wanted to dismiss the strategy, to write it off as luck or coincidence. But Mackenzie's men weren't lucky. They were smart, patient, and skilled at what they did. They knew the terrain, they knew how to be invisible, and they knew how to strike fast and hard before slipping away into the dense jungle before the Japanese even realized what had happened. The first truly large-scale success of Mackenzie's strategy came just after Christmas 1942. The Japanese had established a series of well-defended supply depots deep in the jungle. These depots were the lifeblood of their advance. Without them, their forces would grind to a halt. Mackenzie's orders were clear: disrupt these supply lines at all costs. It was a risky mission, one that could easily go wrong, but Mackenzie's patrols were ready. The soldiers set off just before dawn, moving quietly through the jungle. The air was thick with moisture, the ground slick and treacherous beneath their boots. The sound of distant bird calls and the rustling of leaves was the only noise that filled the silence of the morning. The patrol was made up of the most experienced men, all of whom had been with Mackenzie from the beginning. They knew the plan, they knew the risks, but they also knew how to stay alive. They moved like shadows, their rifles slung across their backs, each step carefully placed. There was no room for mistakes. For days, Mackenzie's men trekked deeper into enemy territory, dodging Japanese patrols, using the dense trees and thick vines to hide their movements. They avoided direct contact with the enemy, sticking to their original mission: intelligence and sabotage. By the time they reached the first of the supply depots, they had evaded detection. They had learned to move with the quiet grace of the jungle itself. As they set their explosives, the weight of the mission was palpable. If the depots were destroyed, the Japanese would lose critical supplies. If they were caught, it could spell disaster. But Mackenzie's patrols were precise. They set their charges and retreated as quietly as they had come. Moments later, the depot exploded in a massive fireball, sending shockwaves through the jungle. The explosion echoed in the distance, but Mackenzie's men were already moving, vanishing back into the trees, completely undetected. The results were immediate. The Japanese, caught completely off guard, struggled to contain the damage. The loss of supplies was significant, and their morale began to falter. What had started as an isolated incident soon became part of a larger pattern. Mackenzie's patrols were striking at the heart of the Japanese advance. As they continued to destroy more supply depots, the Japanese began to realize that they were being targeted by an invisible enemy, one they could neither catch nor predict. Their ability to maintain a steady push forward was seriously hindered. Back at headquarters, the Australian commanders began to take notice. The intelligence Mackenzie's teams provided was invaluable. They had destroyed over 50 key targets in just a matter of weeks, and the results were undeniable. It was clear that Mackenzie's unconventional tactics were not only working, but they were causing a disruption of the highest order. The Japanese, now under pressure from all sides, were beginning to feel the strain. They no longer had the luxury of safe supply lines, and their plans to push southward were becoming increasingly difficult. But despite the successes, Mackenzie's patrols faced continued opposition from higher-ups. There were whispers in the command rooms, arguments about whether such tactics could be sustained. Some doubted the wisdom of spreading out their forces too thinly, of relying so heavily on a small number of men. They feared that once the Japanese adapted to the strategy, it would no longer be effective. But Mackenzie knew that he could not afford to stop. The enemy had already adjusted to conventional tactics. This was the new kind of warfare that would turn the tide. As January 1943 arrived, the pressure on the Australian forces was mounting. The Japanese were regrouping, learning from their losses, and they were preparing to strike back. But Mackenzie had already anticipated this. His patrols were not just reacting, they were adapting. They were learning, and their knowledge of the jungle gave them an advantage the Japanese could not replicate. The effectiveness of these small, mobile units continued to grow as they refined their strategies, perfecting their ability to strike with precision and disappear without a trace. The Australians, once trapped in the jungle and fighting for survival, had found a new way to fight back. The Japanese had underestimated them, and now they were paying the price. Mackenzie's patrols had proven that the jungle was not just a barrier, it was a weapon, one that could be used to disrupt and destroy an enemy that thought itself invincible. The war in New Guinea was far from over, but the tide had started to shift. By early 1944, the landscape of the war in the Pacific had begun to shift. The Japanese forces, once sure of their dominance in the region, were now finding themselves pushed back, their resources stretched thin. The Allied forces, particularly the Australians, had proven that the jungle, which had once been a dark, menacing force, could be turned into a weapon. The strategy of small, mobile patrols, pioneered by Mackenzie, had become a cornerstone of the Australian approach to jungle warfare. It was no longer an experimental tactic. It was the new way of fighting in the Pacific. As the war moved forward, the jungle warfare tactics that had once been seen as unorthodox had now been embraced by military leaders across the Pacific. Mackenzie's ideas, born in the dense, humid jungles of New Guinea, had become a model for other Allied forces to follow. The impact of his patrols was felt far beyond the jungles of New Guinea. From Bougainville to the Solomon Islands, his strategies were implemented, with Australian forces making small but significant advances against the entrenched Japanese positions. The initial skepticism from higher-ups had been replaced by admiration and respect. Mackenzie's patrols had achieved the impossible. They had turned the tide of the war in a way that no one had thought possible. The jungle had once been a place of fear, a place where soldiers were swallowed by the earth, their bodies lost to the dense undergrowth. Now, it was a place where the Australians had gained the upper hand. The Japanese, who had once held the advantage with their larger, more heavily armed forces, were now fighting an enemy they could neither see nor predict. Mackenzie's men had shown that the jungle could be used against them, that the dense trees, the thick vines, and the unpredictable terrain were not just obstacles to be overcome, but advantages to be exploited. It was a new kind of warfare, one that relied on speed, stealth, and the element of surprise. But as the war raged on, the cost of these victories became clear. Mackenzie's patrols had proven effective, but they had also come at a high price. The men who fought in the jungle, moving silently through the dense undergrowth, knew the danger. They knew that each mission could be their last. The casualties were high. The jungle wore on them, physically and mentally. It was not just the heat or the fatigue. It was the constant awareness, the ever-present tension of waiting for something that could come at any moment. The pressure was overwhelming. The jungle could be full of sounds, birds, insects, but every rustle carried the weight of potential danger. The men had learned to stay alert, but it came at the cost of their peace. Mackenzie, too, felt the weight of the war on his shoulders. The responsibility of leading the patrols, of knowing that the lives of his men depended on his decisions, was a burden he carried every day. He had seen the cost of his tactics, seen the men who had been lost to the jungle, their bodies never recovered. He had witnessed the quiet toll that the war had taken on his soldiers, the sleepless nights, the endless hours spent in the oppressive heat, the constant fear of death lurking just around the corner. But despite it all, Mackenzie knew that his tactics had made a difference. The war was still far from over, but the Australian forces had proven their ability to fight in a way no one had thought possible. They had taken the jungle, once an enemy, and turned it into their greatest weapon. In the years that followed, Mackenzie's role in the war would become part of Australian military legend. he would never receive the recognition he deserved, at least not in his lifetime. The High Command, who had once doubted his methods, would eventually come to see the value in his approach. But Mackenzie was never one for accolades or fame. He had been a quiet man, a man who had learned to listen to the land, to move with the jungle rather than against it. His reward came not in medals or public recognition, but in the knowledge that his tactics had helped turn the tide of the war. As the war drew to a close, Mackenzie's strategies continued to shape military doctrine. His ideas, once considered radical, had become the foundation for future military tactics in jungle warfare. The small, mobile patrols that had once seemed like a desperate gamble had proven to be a game changer. They had allowed the Australians to outmaneuver the Japanese, to strike when the enemy least expected it, and to retreat before the Japanese could retaliate. The legacy of Mackenzie's patrols lived on long after the war ended. But for Mackenzie, the war was never truly over. The toll it had taken on him, on his men, was something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He returned to Australia after the war, but he was a changed man. The quiet man who had once surveyed forests had become a leader of men, a man who had guided his patrols through the jungles of New Guinea and beyond. But the weight of the war, the weight of the lives lost, stayed with him. He never spoke much about the battles, about the tactics that had changed the course of the war. He simply carried on, knowing that his work had been done, and that the men he had led would be remembered for their bravery, their resilience, and their ability to adapt to the impossible. In the years that followed, Mackenzie's tactics became a model for special forces units around the world. The small mobile patrols that had once been the cornerstone of his strategy were now seen as a blueprint for future operations. The success of these patrols had proven that even in the most difficult of environments, with the right leadership and tactics, victory was possible. Mackenzie's name, though never widely recognized during his lifetime, became synonymous with the idea of fighting smart, not just hard. His tactics were studied in military academies, and his approach to warfare in the jungle became a core part of special forces training. The lessons of Mackenzie's patrols, of the men who had fought in the dense jungles of New Guinea and beyond, are still relevant today. In a world where modern warfare often relies on technology and overwhelming firepower, the story of Mackenzie's small, mobile patrols serves as a reminder that sometimes the key to victory is not in the strength of your army, but in your ability to adapt, to use the terrain to your advantage, and to strike when the enemy least expects it. Mackenzie's legacy is not just in the victories his patrols won, but in the way they changed the way wars are fought. In the end, the jungle had become not a barrier, but a battlefield, and Mackenzie had shown the world how to win it.